afternoon. My name is Leah Frieden, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Fayetteville Public Library. And welcome to those watching through live stream as well. Before you leave today, please do take a moment to fill out the evaluations that we've left for you. Those help us to plan for future programs. I am so delighted to be having this panel at the library today and to welcome our panelists and our moderator. Moderating our discussion today is Elena Littlefeather, an Indigenous woman who was born on and spent most of her adolescence on a Navajo reservation. She is a storyteller and educator of the First Nations. Kate Hart is the author of After the Fall and a contributor to the anthologies Never Whistle at Night, Davy June's legendary Fry Bread Drive-In, Out Now, Body Talk, Toil and Trouble, and Hope Nation. Before becoming a writer, Kate earned degrees in Spanish and history at Hendrix College, taught preschool and middle school, and wrote grants. Born in Oklahoma and raised in Arkansas, she is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation with Choctaw heritage and lives with her family on an Ozark mountainside where she co-owns Natural State Tree Houses and sells fiber arts and beadwork as Kate Hart Studios. Tony Jensen's Carrie, a memoir of survival on stolen land, is a memoir and essays about gun violence, land, and Indigenous women's lives. A National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship recipient in 2020, Jensen's essays have appeared in Orion, Catapult, and Ecotone. She is also the author of the short story collection From the Hilltop. She teaches at the University of Arkansas and the Institute of American Indian Arts. She is Métis. Andrea L. Rogers is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and she has published 3 books this year. 2 picture books, When We Gather and Chooch Helped, plus her newest novel, The Art Thieves, A Cherokee Futurism. Andrea's YA collection of short stories, Man-Made Monsters, received 6 starred reviews and won the Walter Dean Myers Award for Teens. She lives in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Please join me in welcoming them.
Okay, we can start. Okay, so hi everyone. Like Leah said, my name is Elena. I am from the Museum of Native American History, so it's an incredible pleasure to be here and see everyone here. Thank you so much for coming in. I'm a little nervous, but I'm really good at asking questions, so it's going to be fine. As Leah has mentioned, I am Navajo. I am Navajo from both my mother and father's side, so to kind of help me get used to being here, it's really customary of me to introduce myself in my Navajo language. So it's just a way of making sure that you guys know who I am, where I come from, and a little bit about my lineage. So especially to you, Kate, Tony, and Andrea. Yat'e, she'e, Elena, Littlefeather, Yinshie, Kloga Inshlon, Tsitsikani Bashinshi, Kiani Dashiche, Hashklishni Dashinele. Cool. So nice to officially meet you all. So, it's really awesome that we have all 3 of you here because, especially for me, I'm a little starstruck and I'm so nervous to actually be talking to you guys and asking you guys these questions because as an Indigenous person, it is so extremely hard to grow up with representation. I personally didn't grow up seeing or reading books about us specifically, and even when we had representation, I feel like a lot of it was very tropey and very, but I'm really happy that I've been able to sample some of your works and see a lot of things because I know that people from my family and as young as, I just had a niece born last week that she can grow up with this type of representation. So I just want to take a moment to thank you guys all for putting that representation out and just sharing everything with us. So my first question for all of you is, what does it mean for you to be Indigenous? Yeah, we can start.
All right. Is this on? Okay, good. Osio Nagata, Andrea L. Rogers, Dawadoa, G. Chalagi. And so I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And for me, growing up, it was very cool in Tulsa to see Native art and culture everywhere. And like statistically, half the people I would meet claimed they were Native. And at least 1 out of every 4 probably really was. And so I saw it everywhere, and and cultural values are, art is how we express cultural values. So storytelling, art, that's how human beings share culture, and that's also how they make culture perpetuate. So, if you're not seeing it in the kids, then it's not gonna live very long. And so, for me, being Cherokee means that I'm part of a community. And so, we're not in competition with each other. I want to see all the Cherokee writers possible. I want to see all the Inuit and the Yupik writers possible, because again, that's one way we can share culture. Language is one, food is one, but when you're a writer, you can kind of get all of that stuff in there. And so you can world build in a way that privileges indigenous worldviews. And I really do think indigenous worldviews are better for the planet and for people and for human beings. And so if you're part of a community, then you're part of a community. And so what you do impacts your community, and what your community's health also impacts you. So for me, being Cherokee, I'm also a citizen. I vote in our elections. And I also vote in the other elections that we all don't want to talk about anymore. And so, but I do have a responsibility to know what's going on. And my tribe has a responsibility to me and everyone else. And so that's part of that's being Cherokee.
Well, first I'd like to say thank you for that introduction, because I do teach still a little bit at Institute of American Indian Arts, which was where I first met Andrea. It's really comfortable for me to hear someone introduce themselves in a traditional Diné way, because that happens there literally all the time because it's New Mexico. So thank you, I appreciate that. It's so good to see all of you here, and thanks for coming out on a Sunday, a time change Sunday right before the election we're not speaking of, I guess. So that's really good. Yeah, so I'm Métis, so Buju, Oki, hello, hello. I have to do it twice because where I'm from is Alberta, where my family's from, and so there's 2 distinct tribal populations there that really impact what it means to be Métis. But I grew up in rural Iowa. There were a series of intermarriages and divorces and land thefts and land grabs that caused a branch of the family to move south, right? Including my great-grandmother and her family. And so though my uncles went back and forth, I grew up very much in rural Iowa, which just today is maybe going Democrats, according to the polls. Oh. So, so anyway, I've been on the phone all morning trying to see if there's anything I can do to be useful, back home this week. So I'm really excited about all of that. But what it means to be Indigenous, or Métis more specifically to me, just is an inherently community-based worldview. I have a hard time articulating it, because when someone says, well, how do you, what does that mean to you in the day-to-day? It just means everything. It's in the way I walk through the world. It's in the way I interact with people. It's how I talk about politics and language and aesthetics and teaching and, administrating, now that I'm directing the program now in creative writing at University of Arkansas. And I find I often approach those conversations differently than other people in the room, right? Because it's a community-centered, and the community includes the land and the animals and the water and all the people in a way that I think is not necessarily true in dominant Western mainstream culture. So for me, being Indigenous is just walking through the world maybe a little differently, and then trying to navigate, in this sort of a space in Arkansas, and then trying to navigate, how that is, how it's different, and how to articulate why, as Andrea said so well, that perhaps it's a better worldview in many ways. Not that we always have to have everything be in competition, but in these times, advocating for the environment and for everyone having dignity and rights and greeting each other with dignity and in community, I think is probably more important than ever. So that's a little bit of what being Indigenous means to me.
Chokma, Halito, that's kind of all the language I know, unfortunately. Being Indigenous for me, I think, is a little bit different. I had a similar family rupture. I was born in Tulsa. My mom grew up in Tulsa and Ada, Oklahoma. But she was separated from her Chickasaw side, and so growing up I was as well. And we lived in St. Louis and then moved here, so I really was not involved in community at all. Always knew that we were Native, but did not actually really start to reconnect on a personal level until my 30s. So for me, it's a little bit different just because I feel like I'm still finding my place in the community. But I can say kind of the turning point for me was when I went to our annual reunion at Cullahoma and went to the stomp dance and sat down with some elders, and they asked who my people were, and I explained, and the woman put her hand on mine and said, "Welcome home." And for me, really, that's what it is. It's just a coming home to, what it has meant for my family to be both white and indigenous. Separating out, what does my family do because we're Native, and what do we do just because we're Okies? It's always kind of hard to tell. But so, yeah, for me, it's really a homecoming and trying to do everything I can to pass that down to my children who are teenagers here in Fayetteville, and finding my way into then telling the stories that I know are true to my family and hopefully resonate with other Indigenous people as well.
Very good answers. Okay, so now that we've kind of established a little bit more about our personal identities with our specific tribes and our people and just being Indigenous in general, I wanted to ask, how does your Native American culture and identity influence your work and your writing process in general?
Well, for me, I try and make sure I get Cherokee language in as often as possible in ways that make sense, and because built into the language are cultural values, and so that's important to me. I also try and make sure I boost up the work of other Native people, and also try and help younger writers who maybe don't know how to get there, or illustrators who don't know how to get there, and I try and kind of give some guidance and direction in that way. And just having, it's so funny because so many stories in Man-Made Monsters are from my family, and then I throw in a vampire or a werewolf, but then so many other people were like, how did you know this story? This happened to us, or whatever. And so, and it's, because there are certain touchstones that, certain beliefs, and in a worldview where it's not magic, it's not, it's spiritual, and it's the way we see the world, and it's, not supernatural so much as just creator being in the world and the world being responsive to us as humans. And so I just try and write in a way that won't harm young people, especially young Native people, especially young Native women, write in a way that advocates for them and lets them know they're loved. And I guess that's really kind of what I try and do.
Yeah, I would second a lot of that, and I would add that I feel like too, a lot of the stories that I've been telling have to do with power and structures and things that are often expressed in dominant culture as being hierarchical, right? So up, down, or down, up. And I think that what an Indigenous worldview has to add, and maybe my own particular worldview has to add to those conversations, is I see them sideways. I don't see them as up, down. And so I'm most interested in thinking about how our structures are serving everyone, especially the disenfranchised. And then just approaching that conversation broadly and from a more collective or communal sort of lens. And so how that includes Indigenous people is that, we're often left off the chart, in any poll, in any group of representation, from literature and the arts to politics and voting to all of it. And so, making sure that I start there. So I start with the people, my own people, who are not even on the chart and are not part of the conversation, and then I move out from there. And decentering who gets to start a conversation, I think, can be really important. So putting Indigenous people and Métis people in particular at the center is something that that I'm trying to do in my creative work.
I agree with all of that, and I think on a a personal level, I have always been a history nerd, just in general, as a history major in college. And so I find myself really trying to go back into the history and see the places where natives have been very overlooked. For example, right now I'm working on a book that is set in Eureka Springs, and it has ended up being this deep dive into the history of medicine. And I don't think a lot of people realize how much the development of the medical system in the United States was based partly on these misrepresentations and appropriations and just, bizarre uses of native images and ideas. So, just kind of trying to bring those things into a modern context and make people rethink what they think they know about, Native people and their own history.
Very nice. You guys speak so well. You're so grown up. Something that all of us can really relate to as far as Indigenous ancestry, really just a human thing in general, is our ancestors have always had the gift of storytelling. It was a way of remembering how we were in the past, where we come from, who we are, the reason why the world is the way that the world is. And so not many people really recognize that storytelling is also our form of survival as well. And I see both of those things in all of your work. So I'm going to ask you individually some questions, but there is going to be some specific ones that I'm welcoming you to answer them. But if you have a say in anything, please feel free to say something, okay? So for Tony, hi. In your book, Carrie, a memoir of survival on stolen land, it was probably, it was the biggest title that struck out to me a lot, because it just dives in there. It does what a title should do. You read it, you think, oh my gosh, what is this about? And so by using the word stolen land, I wanted to ask all of you, what does stolen land mean from an Indigenous perspective? What does that mean for people who don't really understand what that is?
Yeah, thank you. That Carrie was my contribution to the title of that one little word. And then when you write a book of nonfiction, the subtitle gets workshopped pretty heavily. So I had a lot of help with the most impressive part of the title. I feel like my agent and my editor handled that beautifully, and they're neither one of them Indigenous, but deeply thoughtful. Better with subtitles than the writer, so that's how that came about. But as far as why I agreed to it, out of the 40 or 50 titles that we workshopped, so in my family's history, up in Alberta and most of Canada, there was a thing called a scrip, a Métis scrip, and so you have this piece of paper that says this belongs to you or this doesn't. And I think we're all well familiar probably from stories in media and books and articles that, about native land grabs, right? I think especially recently with the attention, through film and TV. But up there was some straight old-fashioned land grab, and then there were people pretending to be Métis or marrying into families, and that was the case in my own family history. So stolen land is literal and figurative in my case, and so I was interested in these ideas, like if you're stealing the land, and the land is part of the culture and the people and the stories, what does that mean? What does that mean for the people and the culture and the stories if the literal land, which is all entwined with that, right, is gone and is inherited now down toward a family, who's saying they're you, but they're not. And so that was sort of first in my mind, and then I just took that concept and applied it more broadly across all of the United States, all the places I've lived, and looked at the histories of tribes there. And I mean, that includes like Arizona and Nebraska and Iowa and South Dakota and Arkansas and, all sorts of places, Pennsylvania, lots of swing states in there. And so I just, and that history's literally everywhere. There's nowhere you can go in the whole country where that's not part of the history, including here, especially here. You work at a land-grant institution, who did they get the land from? Who was there? In our case, about 11 tribes. And so, so I think just knowing that, I knew that intuitively, but to quantify it was part of where that subtitle went. Yeah.
Very nice. And Kate and Andrea, did you guys have anything to add on that?
Yeah, and Tony does it really powerfully in her collection, so it's true to that title. so definitely with stolen land, in Oklahoma, well, forever actually, when the Cherokee were in what we now call Georgia and North Carolina, men would come who wanted to do business with the tribe. Often these men had families somewhere else. They had white wives and children somewhere else. And they would come to our land and they would marry into the tribe as a way to gain power and money and land. And so women were always the pathway to wealth for white men forever in this country. And so when the women are utilized to steal the land, I mean, I can't think of a more powerful metaphor about the way women can be exploited, and that tribes can be overwhelmed with a different worldview and a loss of resources. In Oklahoma specifically, when Oklahoma became a state, they had a ceremony where they had a woman dressed up as a native person marrying Mr. Oklahoma. And so, it's quite literal, using women to obtain land. And then of course it's something that it was happening in all the tribes, and so everywhere. And so, even national parks are stolen land, especially. They wanted to preserve our land, but not us. They wanted, and so, anyway, yeah, that's what that means.
Yeah,
So-
Chickasaw Nation has basically the same, the Trail of Tears history. We actually were the last of I think the 5 tribes to come across. Choctaw Nation came, I think, 6 or 7 years ahead of us and settled southeast Oklahoma in that area. And I think we actually wanted to go to Texas, and the feds were like, no, you've got to go there. But we have kind of an interesting wrinkle where a lot of the land that was given to the Chickasaw Nation belonged to Comanche and Kiowa, Arapaho, like a lot of the western tribes who at the time were considered still wild while we were considered civilized, which unfortunately meant in a lot of cases that we also were slave owners. And so when Chickasaw Nation came over, we actually couldn't settle on the land we were given because all of our horses and farms would be stolen and burned. So there's this very interesting, stealing on top of stealing on top of stealing, and then part of Chickasaw Reservation was cut away after the Civil War because we've sided with the Confederacy, hoping, well, these white guys screwed us, maybe these will do us better, So it's a very complicated, when I start thinking about, the land and what it means and it being taken away, and there's all these layers on top of it, it's a very hard thing to express to folks who haven't grown up hearing it and knowing it and researching it. But it's just never simple. And with the women being married in on top of it, it's just, it's kind of mind-boggling.
I do want to add something. So part of the problem with the Cherokee Nation in the South that people around them had a problem with was it was a law that our land was held communally, and you didn't own the land. Period. That meant you couldn't sell it. It meant it was there for everyone. You could use what you could use, what you were able to work, you could use, and your improvements were yours. But you were not allowed to cut up the land and sell it. And so it was actually, I think, Dawes who remarked that, there was a problem because the Cherokee were too unselfish, and that if they could just get them to be a little more greedy, that the Cherokee tribe would go far. And so, because at the time, there wasn't hunger. You were feeding people who needed fed. You weren't supposed to have too much. That was all antithetical to Cherokee values then. And so it was actually, we were actually pushed to be more greedy and more selfish. And part of that was by cutting up the land.
We also had a situation where the Chickasaw schools that had been established in Oklahoma were far superior to any of the white schools in the surrounding area and states. And that was part of it, was the feds took that over because they didn't want Chickasaw children to learn to read and write and do math. They wanted them to learn to work the land and be good housewives. And so we have kind of a unique boarding school history with the 5 tribes, but that was another of the methods they used.
Thank you all so much for answering that question. I know that most of my questions are a little bit hard to talk about. This is kind of a Debbie Downer convention, but we're talking about really important things, and I wanted to take a moment to really deep dive into some of these terms because I work in the museum, and my main sector is the gift shop, where we highlight a lot of contemporary artists, and I like to take a moment to talk about issues that are presently happening. And so, I have little stickers that say stolen land and things like that. And people who don't come from an indigenous background come up to me and say, what does this mean? And it's really hard to explain to people that term because, as Kate said, it's layers on layers on layers. And from all of your perspectives, we included a lot of deep history issues that happen, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, and it reflects presently into our cultures today. For the Navajo Nation specifically, we're still fighting to have rights on our land. We're having issues with the federal government transporting uranium on our lands without our knowledge. So these are just things that are a little bit difficult to understand. So I wanted to take a moment to kind of deep dive into that term because a lot of people feel that it's aggressive and it's targeted at most cases, but really we're just trying to put a message out, open a conversation, and let them know what our perspective is and our history on it. So thank you so much for opening up. So for people who do not come from a Native background or are not well educated on Standing Rock, what do you think should be important for others to understand about situations like this, and why is it more than just a Native issue? And this question specifically is for Tony.
Yeah, from my point of view, I spent a little bit of time there. It wasn't just a Native issue, right? Like, it was a coming together of all sorts of people from all over the country and all over the world. Yes, tribal people were there in the most force with our flags flying, every all the tribal flags. It was one of the most beautiful things I've seen, probably anytime, anywhere. But also, there were war veterans showing up en masse to protect Native people, to link arms and protect them from sheriff's men, deputies, National Guard. It was a really, multicultural, multidimensional event, right? It brought together a whole bunch of different demographics to a degree that I would never have anticipated. And it was all based around the idea that we all need and have an inherent sovereign right to have clean drinking water, which is going to be the main conversation of the future, here and everywhere. And so to make it sort of a political Native act and to call it a protest when it was really a peaceful gathering, interrupted in non-peaceful ways by interdisciplinary governmental efforts, I think was the main problem with the perception of what happened there. And so, I think it's important to know about that history for anyone who cares about individual rights and anyone who cares about clean water or the environment, that Native people led this. It was a beautiful gathering of peaceful Native people. Anyone who wasn't peaceful in a camp got, evicted quickly and skillfully. And so the peace was broken only from, an outside force of sheriff's deputies from all over the country came and National Guardsmen. And so that was a coordinated effort too. And I think it's important to think about those sorts of efforts. Who wants to be for the water and for peace, and who wants to be for the breaking up of peaceful gatherings, to deny us access to things we should have ready availability for.
Yeah, the Standing Rock in general, I was 17, 18 about that time. I was a senior in high school. And I don't mean to get emotional about it, but it's an important thing to talk about.
Yeah, it is.
I grew up in a family where, we have generational trauma, and we have moments where I hear their stories, but they're not my stories. It hurts, and it's rough hearing it from your mom and your grandma. But this was the first time that it happened in my life, and I remember I was in, of all places, a yoga classroom. And shout out to Miss Go, because she was amazing. But I remember she took the moment to talk to my classmates about this issue. And she put on a little educational video on it. And I'm sitting there, and I the whole event in itself was really raw. And I was really sensitive about it. But I just remember sitting in the middle of this classroom. And it meant so much. And it's to the basics, it's just water. We want clean water. And I remember like intensely looking at this video thinking about, oh, I don't want to think about this. I think about this when I get home, but we're talking about it now. And I went to a predominantly, white school, and just no one caring, no one listening. Everyone's on their phones talking, or you couldn't even hear the video. And I just remember sitting there feeling so alone. And so I think that when I saw your book, and it's a rough thing to talk about, and hardly do people want to have the conversation to dive into it, but it's really important to talk about because it's not just a Native issue, it's a human issue. And so I just really appreciate you taking the time to talk about it and expanding upon it a little bit. I didn't mean to get emotional on you guys, but so yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
On another note, Kate, in your book, After the Fall, which, by the way, if you guys haven't read the back of After the Fall, the description, that is the way to go about it, because literally the first sentence is, Rachel is sleeping with 2 guys. And I thought, oh, but then the more you read about it, the more you understand the plot and you know what's going on. But I really noticed that just from reading the back of, the description of the book, that you talk a lot about some issues that are happening with Indigenous youths right now. And without even reading the book in general, I already related to the main character, Rachel, just because I see her story told in both our brothers and sisters right now, where we have issues about continuing to go to college. And, we have a lot of issues with, assault and, some tough things to talk about. So, my question is, can you please share why you decided to include these struggles in your storyline?
Yeah, so After the Fall is a young adult novel. It's for teenagers. And it's based really heavily on growing up here in a college town. And I wrote this book. I started writing it in 2009, 2010, so it's been a solid 15 years now. But as I was writing, just kind of my experiences growing up here and always trying to keep up with the boys, and I started to realize that some of my experiences that I had not had words for at the time, that actually I had been an assault victim. And I just had never been able to frame it that way until, well into my 30s. And so the book really kind of then developed out of that. There's no Native content at all in After the Fall, and that is partly because the publishing landscape at the time was just white as the driven snow. And I had actually, this is when blogs were happening, I had actually done a 2-year study where I looked at over 800 covers both years of YA novels that had come out just that year, and less than, I'm going to get the math wrong, but it was certainly less than 1% and possibly less than 0.1% had a person of color on the front. Not like there's no Native representation. There was no Asians, no Black folks, nothing. I didn't push to put Native stuff in the book because I was already pushing to have poverty and assault in the book. And I had one little mention of racist mascots, and my editor was like, no, that's too much, I had also lost a book deal because they were treading lightly with Native issues, and I was not Native enough to be writing that book. Oh. So, yeah, good times. So, yeah, when I wrote After the Fall, I felt like I was pushing the limit of what I was being allowed to do at the time. And that was just, it was enough to just get through, my own experiences of assault and growing up relatively poor. By the time I was in high school, we were solidly middle class, but I remembered growing up, asking the neighbors for toilet paper to make it through to payday. And that really, not only was there no racial diversity in YA, but there was really no diversity of any kind. So anyway, that's kind of how that book came to be, and I felt lucky to get it out there at all.
Okay, thank you. So I noticed that when you were talking about, in the previous question that I just asked you, you talked about not being Native enough. Mm-hmm. And that breaks my heart a lot because a lot of people don't really understand that, genetics are funny.
Right.
And we
look
come
a lot of different ways.
We do. And, and it's so crazy how we have this issue of, constantly going against this imagery of what people think natives are. What does an Indian look like? And at the museum, my boss, David, he likes to encourage people to close your eyes. Take a second and close your eyes And when you do, and I say the word Indian, what do you think of? Usually people think of, your stereotypical imagery of a John Wayne film. You painted face, you got the feather in the hair, and it's usually a man, brown skin. But they don't really think and take into account that us natives, we come in many different forms and different colors. Our hairs can be blonde. It's really crazy. And I can see some of your personal experiences in some of your works, specifically in Never Whistle at Night, which, by the way, is a great title. There's a quote that I wanted to talk about where you write, "Gregory surely found the White Dog's Road, if it didn't find him first, because even if he didn't know how to look for it, he didn't need a tribal card to make his way home. The ancestors know the real ones, even the blonde ones." So colorism is just a big issue externally and internally in a lot of Native American communities. And so I wanted to ask all of you, as authors, how do you challenge this particular stereotype of looking the part?
I want to say, being blonde and pale, I usually introduce myself as despite appearances, I am a Chickasaw citizen. And the pushback that I get is usually not within the community. There's a little sometimes, and I understand because there are a lot of what we call pretendians. There are a lot of people who want to be us without actually, taking on the problems and the challenges of being us. But, it's annoying. I have my annoyances. But I don't think it's anywhere near as challenging as what our Black cousins face. And, I really want to make clear that, it's annoying to be the white Indian, but, our Black relatives can't even get their treaty rights recognized. I guess Cherokee Nation has done right. Chickasaw Nation has not.
Yeah.
In my work, I just kind of try to write these characters that are true to what I've experienced and kind of let the chips fall where they may, but.
The Cherokee did finally re-enroll their freedmen, but it was a long and costly fight, and I think emotionally draining, and definitely had repercussions for Black Indigenous people and people who were freedmen descendants. They did finally do right, but there are people who are very unhappy about it, and they're unhappy about the word "by blood" being taken out of the Constitution. And I honestly don't know if it went to a vote if it would have passed. I don't. If the chief hadn't just done an executive action, I don't. And I do think that we're on the right side of history because there's a huge debt. I mean, John Ross was only 1/8 Cherokee. He was Irish, but he was, the traditional's hero, and he tried to keep us in our homelands. And yet, John Ross wasn't out there building roads and bridges and mansions. That was the enslaved people. And I mean, the same everywhere. I mean, you go through Cane Hill, it's like, who do you think built those stone walls? Not your founding fathers, the people they owned. And so there definitely is a debt there. So I try and make sure that one, I mentioned that we have Black Indigenous people. And then when I have 2 picture books out. And so I wanted to make sure that we had the color spectrum gamut. Because I do think the pretendian issue also hurts Black people, Black Indigenous people at a higher, a lot harder, because one, often they feel unwelcome even when they show up to community. And then they're automatically doubted as being really Native. And then to see people who have no claim whatsoever to be welcomed and, lauded, I mean, it's just more of the same, I think, for them that they've had to go through for a long time. And so I wanted to make sure in my books, my picture books especially, that there was some representation by the illustrators. And then in my own writing, the title story, Man-Made Monsters, back when I was working on it, I sent it to Laura Pegram at Quelly, Voices from the Diaspora, which focuses on people who are descendants of Africans and from all over the world. And so I sent her the story, and I had a line in there about servants, and she's like, "Servants, huh?" Well, it's prior to the Civil War, and I was like, she's like, "Tell me more about these servants." And I was like, oh God, no. Oh God, no. please, no. And so I reached out and did the research, and, I was told, well, they would be slaves, they wouldn't be servants. I mean, yeah, white people did come and squat on the land and sometimes get permits to work on tribal land, but they said the rich Cherokees had slaves. And I was just heartsick, because, like, some of my heroes, participated in it, and, regardless of the fact that it was considered a mark of civilization to own human beings, which is really screwed up, so it wasn't something I wanted to talk about or deal with. But I did deal with it, even though I was really embarrassed. I'm embarrassed. So, that our tribe participated in that. And, that Trail of Tears was a lot harder for enslaved people than it was for the people who own them. And yes, it was the 1%ers, and yes, there are 1%ers everywhere. 99% of the tribe didn't own people, and the traditionals didn't believe in it, but they also didn't do anything to stop it. So anyway, I do try and include Black, Indigenous people, freedmen, descendants in my other work, my fiction as well. And then I have to make sure I run it by a beta reader to make sure I don't screw it up too bad. So.
Yeah, I would add, first, I will say I've been a part of these sorts of conversations for a really long time, and they're often quiet and stilted, and so this is easily the most thorough, detailed, open one I've ever been a part of, which I think, speaking to the differences in the world from the experience with your first book and all of that, the world is changing, and people are talking about these things. Native people are talking about these things more openly, and people are asking better questions, and I'm really here to celebrate all of that. Métis is an inherently mixed identity, so I maybe get a little less of this than anything else. So being Métis just means that probably a trapper and trader somewhere down the line moved to Indigenous territory, way up north somewhere, and intermarried or not, but children were born, and that's how the Métis people there. It's a distinct political category, a distinct population in Canada from Indigenous people and also from non-Indigenous people, right? It's its own category. In the States, in Minnesota and North Dakota in particular, you have a lot of Métis people. Also, a surviving, doing well little tribe in Montana. And so, so there it's slightly different categorically, but we're inherently mixed. So as I get older, the way that I handle it if things come up like interpersonally or about my work is I just say, I look just like my dad the older I get, except he was darker than I am. And if you think that that is like the most important part of this conversation, I can't really help you. Yeah. I'm just very like, oh, look at you, and kind of pat him on the head and walk away. I think people are mostly, they're either out to get a reaction, or they're well-meaning and trying to connect, or they're jealous, or there's all sorts of reasons people act the way they do, but none of that has anything to do with me, is how I feel about it. And I honestly get very little of it because I'm a very direct person, I think. And now, it used to sort of upset me, and it upsets me on behalf of my students when it happens to them, and boy, that gets handled different. That gets handled. That gets handled differently. But when it's personal, it's not personal. It's always about whatever that person is bringing to the conversation, I feel like. Their own insecurities, their own fears, their own competitive nature. And there's nothing to be done about those folks except patting them on the head.
The secret weapon is you start explaining blood quantum. And you just go into the long lecture about, 7 generations ago, we had, this and this and this happening, and you just watch their eyes glaze over and let them float away.
Yep.
Thank you guys so much for answering that question. It's really tricky answering a lot of these questions, so I know that it's a lot, but you're handling really well. And if I were the ones answering these questions, I don't know how I do it, so... So moving on to the next one, Andrea, your books are the first ones that I've seen that have such a fun spin on fantasy and history and cultural representation. There are tons out there, but yours were really fun, and I really liked it. And I really want to talk a little bit more about man-made monsters. As a fan of horror books, I love the concept of incorporating indigenous history and folklore because not many people know, but we got some spooky tales. So the idea of your book, you're following one family through 2 centuries. And, you go through several different types of stories about specific people. But one thing that you really talked about that I think is important to discuss a little bit further is generational trauma. And so I just wanted you to kind of expand upon that a little bit more and tell me a little bit why you wanted to include that in there.
Okay, so I was a big fan of Interview with a Vampire back in college and high school. And so she had 200 years with a vampire, right? And so as someone who recognizes, at least at my age now, I finally recognize that some people are well-intentioned and they're just ignorant. And and that ignorance, though, is planned. That ignorance is, built into who was approving books, for schools in the 1920s. I mean, and how little changes from that. I don't know. There's a great documentary called The Neutral Ground, and they explore how the widows of the Confederates were the ones that were sitting on the school boards and making sure, certain textbooks were bought and taught and certain ones weren't. And so, if you think about the way education worked and didn't work for us at times, people are very conscious of the product they want to come out of schools. And generally, that product is a good employee. And so teaching critical thinking sometimes falls to the wayside. But you can learn to think critically, but if you don't have any of the facts, then how can you think critically? And so, and that's definitely behind some of these book bans, because people don't want to be made to feel bad by being told real history. Never mind that the rest of us felt really bad for a really long time and didn't get to see our history at all. And so with generational trauma, though, and the book, just recognizing that every generation faced something different and new. And especially for Native people, they wanted to take the Native out of us, to take the indigenous worldview out of us, and train us to be good workers, employees, servants, whatever. And so I start in 1839, but I actually start in Texas. And the reason I start there is because when I moved to Texas, I had no idea that a bunch of Cherokees and other tribal people were murdered, massacred outside of Dallas in Van Zandt County, closer to Tyler. It's Chief Bowles, and he was 80. He was basically assassinated on the battlefield. And so I didn't know that, though. I grew up in Tulsa. I was only 5 hours from there, but I didn't know about, the Texas Cherokees that tried to make land have a land in Texas too. First with Mexico and then later with Texas. And so, but, Indian removal came knocking for them just as it came here, because there were Cherokees who had moved here to Arkansas, where I live out on Highway 71. There were Cherokees out there. And so, Sequoia was here. There were a lot of Cherokees here, but then 1839 comes and we had to go. We had to go. And that included the Native people who were in Texas, who were being told they had to go to Indian Territory. And because they didn't go quickly enough, they ended up getting massacred. And that was, it was a late story for me. I think it's possible that I have people in my family. There's a woman named Susie Spaniard. Usually if you got called the Spaniard, it was because you spoke Spanish. And so it's very possible she came from that group, because they did kill the men and they held some of the women prisoners and then sent them back to Indian Territory eventually, some of them. So, so all that is to say that I recognize that every generation had some new assault on them. And, whether it was an assault on the family by taking children and basically making them orphans, and sending them to a boarding school where when they came back home, eventually they couldn't even speak to their family anymore. That's how you break a family, right? That's how you model how not to parent, right? I mean, and then these people go and have children, right? And, having come from this dysfunctional, basically forced into guardianships and foster programs, basically, and some of which were very abusive, and, where mostly what they learned how to do was work, and they learned how to work in ways that would benefit, the dominant society. And so, starting in 1839, we've got Indian removal. I had written a book on the Trail of Tears called Marion the Trail of Tears for children, and I had researched that heavily. And I thought it was important that someone who actually had ancestors who survived that write that book for kids. Because when I looked around, there weren't any books like that. And so, 1839 was important, and bad things happened to Indians. And so then moving on from that, we have the Golden Age, where the Cherokee people rebuilt everything, and we have schools again, and we have a newspaper again. But of course, that Golden Age is on the backs of enslaved people. And then you have after the Civil War. So every generation dealt with something different. And that was something I thought was sort of a missed opportunity for conversations in Interview with a Vampire. But if you go back and read it, Lestat targets Louis because he's a slave owner with a big plantation, and it's actually kind of awful. And so, but, he is interested in all the pretty things. And so I thought that was fun, but what would a Cherokee vampire do, and what would they see, and how would they help their own survive every new onslaught? Because first you have to survive before you can turn around and thrive. And so we have to get there first. And that's what I wanted and thought was important for each character in my book, that they survive. And because that tells young people that you can too.
Thank you. You also have another book. You have a lot of books, but this one's fairly recent, and it's called The Art of Thieves. And the main description of your book is, in the year 2052, Stevie Henry is a Cherokee girl working at a museum in Texas, trying to save up enough money to go to college. The world around her is in a cycle of drought and superstorms, ice and fire. People get by, but it's about to get a whole lot worse. When a mysterious boy shows up at Stevie's museum saying that he's from the future and telling her what is to come, she refuses to believe him. But soon she will have no choice. So, obviously in this book, futurism is going on.
Yep.
And so my question to all of you is, what does an Indigenous future look like to each and every one of you?
So I think 2 weeks ago, I renamed it Indian Territory Futurisms. So that way I can include everybody in Oklahoma and make it a much bigger genre, or Indian Territory Lit. And so I was with Rilla Askew, and she's like, what do you want to call this? I'm like, on the spot. And I'm like, Indian Territory Futurisms, that's what we're doing. Daniel Wilson wrote one with Robe Apocalypse, and there's some great ones out there. And so what I was doing with the Art Thieves and thinking about Indigenous futurisms, Indian Territory futurisms, is what we want the world to look like eventually. And of course, planning for a better world means that you might be making sacrifices for things you will never see that may or may not benefit your own children or not. And so being able to write and sort of take the lessons that are out there based on history and sociology and plan for a better world is really fun. And so, because you start evaluating what things are important. I mean, when we talk about stolen land, there are treaties in place, and those treaties are not honored. So they were either negotiated in bad faith, if there's no intention to honor them. But for instance, part of the treaty rights, recently they said the Navajo, they don't owe the Navajo water. You can have your land, but you can't have the water. And that's crazy. And so, but then I think about places where there are countries where people respect the rights of the river. The river has rights. It's a living thing, and it is a living thing. Water is a living thing. I'm water, you're water, and, you know, if you're drinking poisoned water, we're not going to be in great shape. And so Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean water. And, you know, so it's not just a native issue, obviously. You know, it's about everything. And so, but we all live in the same world. And so when I'm thinking about a future for Indigenous people, it's not just for Indigenous people because we all live together. And that's why I thought art was important, because art can help you share cultural values, but art doesn't mean anything if you don't have people. And so my hope is that we can encourage everyone, or at least ourselves, to live more intentionally. And so when I think about an Indigenous future, it's based on living intentionally now, and, you know, making spaces for Native language, putting it on signs, you know, creating small communities where you can practice the language in an everyday way. And so, and then expanding out from there with, you know, with your Indigenous foods and the gardens. And that's something I think Cherokee Nation has done really well, is they have an Indigenous seed program, and so Cherokee Nation citizens can get Indigenous seeds. But, you know, and then cultural items like baskets, like trying to bring back River King. Cherokee Nation people have been very invested in trying to revive river cane, which is the only indigenous bamboo in this grass in this country, and which was basically our plastic. It was like we made everything from it. And so, you know, plastic hasn't been so great for us. But, you know, using this indigenous bamboo, you could have made what you slept on, your houses. And so I think about a world that we're just living more intentionally in it now so that we can have a better future.
Yeah, I work with a lot of students who are working on Indigenous Futurism's written projects, both at Institute of Indian Arts and some here too, or are writing scholarship around that. And so I'm thinking about it all of the time because they're thinking about it all of the time. And I think that it's important to find pockets and spaces that can feel future forward, and not just immediate future forward, like the week, the month, even the calendar year, but far, far forward, you know, thinking about what the world will be like for our grandchildren and our great-greats and so on. And thinking about that from a site of hope and connection and not just despair, because I think we probably in these times are leaning more toward despair. And so concrete ways, things like what can the natural world give us that isn't plastic? You know, who's working on, I have a lot of environmentalist writer friends too, and a lot of environmentalist friends, scientists who are working on amazing discoveries and amazing proposals and making all these connections. And so seeking that out in the day-to-day is very important for me. And I feel like Indigenous futurisms are just a part of that, or Indian Territory futurism. I love that. I think that's more realistic because it includes everyone in the territories. Yeah. I like that so much. So yeah, just the idea that we can choose how we look forward, and we can choose what we focus on to a certain degree, and not being a Pollyanna about it at all, because we all have moments of despair, of course, but thinking structurally and concretely and hopefully toward the future is necessary to get us to that future. So that's where I sit.
Oh, I'm going to pop back in just because I forgot something super important. So, and I basically studied tons of Afrofuturisms to write The Art Thieves, because that was the only literary space where I felt like they were doing it right. So anyway.
Yeah, so I mean, so far as genre goes, this really is not my area of expertise, but so far as Indigenous futures in general, I'm a pretty pessimistic person, and so this is always very hard for me, but what gives me hope, and the Indian Nation's focus actually kind of put this into perspective for me. I see the things that Chickasaw Nation has been able to offer their citizens, and it's everything from clothing allowances for students, and now they've put in a clothing allowance for elders who need help buying clothes. There's programs that will come mow lawns for elders, chop wood. There's a program for storm shelters, both on the res and off. We're actually about to we're going to get a shelter because they'll give us a little bit of money for it, and that makes it possible for us. And so my hope is that, I know the political situation in Oklahoma is pretty grim right now. The governor is not a friend to the Indian nations. But my hope is that we will lead in caring for our people and showing how that can be done on a pretty big scale. Chickasaw, Cherokee, Choctaw Nation are fairly big. And so that's just my hope, is that we will lead the way in caring and showing how to take care of your community and your people, and that other people in other communities will start to demand that for themselves and for their loved ones and their people. So,
Thank you. I love that all of you have basically included everyone in this situation, because it does include everyone. And as I'm listening to you guys speak and talking about caring for one another, it makes me so happy, because it honestly reminds me of, the elders that I grew up with. It makes me so proud to hear. It's just such a Native thing to just think about the world issues as an everyone's issue. It's not just our own problem. We're not in our own bubble, but it's all connected. We're all connected regardless of who you are, where you came from, what tribe you are. I really love that I hear that in each and every one of you. So I just wanted to thank you all so much for taking this time to answer my really difficult questions. And if any of you had any questions for them, please feel free to ask. But yeah, I'm done here.
you got to call on people now.
Oh, okay. You.
What do you all think about the casinos? Do you feel like the tribes benefit casinos?
Gosh, there's a great episode on Rutherford Falls where he gives a speech about that, because, that is, for instance, like, we have treaties and certain things are supposed to be done and they're not done for us. And so, casinos are one way that we can make money that does help our tribe. It's not, and I don't know. I don't think it's any more or less moral than like a convenience store at this point, because, we've got food deserts. I mean, here in Fayetteville, we have like a dozen strip bars and only Hobby Lobby for art supplies. So it's unfortunate that that's how, to me, it is unfortunate that that's, because when I walk through, I see people from all over who are losing money, and it does make me sad. But I also think that, that's the economic opportunity we were given. Mm-hmm. We were given that and smoke shops. And so that's not really on us. That's like,
we're just trying to survive.
yeah. So go ahead.
Does each tribe get a casino? 'Cause
No.
I only know the Choctaw and the Osage.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how that worked, and if the money directly funnels like to the tribe, or like how that works.
Oh, it's going to be different for every tribe. Yes. Cherokee Nation has a Cherokee Nation business arm that handles all of that,
Yeah,
but the money does go back into, it goes into Oklahoma schools like crazy, not just Native schools.
And
Oklahoma
roads
casino money,
Yeah.
big time, funds the schools in Oklahoma.
I think
Those
almost all-
awesome roads that we all love that cut us right through Oklahoma.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, and I think like almost all the road repairs in southeast Oklahoma is
Yes.
because of Chickasaw and Choctaw Nation. Like the states just, they don't care.
Yeah. And for another perspective too, I'm not from a tribe that has a casino. Métis, different situation. But when I worked and lived on Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, they have a casino. They're considered a casino tribe. It's very small and humble, and it's not, it's very geographically remote. It's on a highway, not in any of the towns. So you have to be driving from like non-native land into native land, and there's all of a sudden this building, right? It employs a lot of people, and that's mostly the economic, there's not very much economic benefit to the tribe outside of tribal employment. So I just put that forward always when this question comes up, because it surprises people. I think everyone assumes it's always a big money-making venture. It varies so widely from like probably, there's a more humble one even in Nebraska. So some places have the really small and humble that mostly are like tribal centers in a way, and house and and employ and feed people. In other cases, they're big money-making ventures for the tribe and for the states in many cases, because they have compacts with the states that demand that, or formal legal relationships that, guess what, the tribes honor. Not that it often works the other way. So I think it varies really widely.
I think one of the only true things for all Native American tribes is that there's really nothing true for all of us, except for maybe the land being taken. Every tribe has different, policies, culture, language, and casinos are no different. It's going to work different depending on, which of the, how many Oklahoma tribes are there?
Well,
50?
there's 39 in
39?
Indian Territory. Yeah,
Okay.
they got removed to Indian Territory, yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's different for everybody, and, some tribes wouldn't benefit from having it, but again, you have to remember that there was major brain drain on reservations because there were no jobs. And so at least that gives you some place where you can have health care and you can have a job.
Not to mention, what's the policy in the 70s? Resettlement?
Oh, relocation.
Relocation,
Yeah,
where they
yeah.
very literally were taking people from the res and sending them to urban centers
Yeah, and
to continue the breaking up,
yeah, after
because the
World War
Dawes
II.
rules weren't enough. To
Yeah,
that didn't work well enough.
yeah.
This has been such a great conversation. We are at time, and so I think we'll leave it there. I just wanted to hop up and give another thank you to Elena for leading us through this very thoughtful conversation, and to Kate and Tony and Andrea for being so engaged, and thank you all for being here and being engaged too. I greatly appreciate it. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate it.
Wado.